Hey, how is everyone doing? It's Dr. Jensen. And finally, we have Module 1, Part 4. Again, thank you for your patience with me. As this class is being created as we go, I will try to get content out to you as soon as I possibly can. But I felt like we needed one more set of slides and lecture just to make sure we're all on the same page with personality types. So, this is the important part of the class. We're starting out with the big stuff, okay? So personality types are super, super important. And I want to kind of give you a little bit of analogy that I'm stealing from the book. So it's easy to go, okay, Dr. Jensen wants me to take some kind of personality test and determine who I am in some little category or box so that she can match me to some career and then I'll get a grade and then this class will be over and I'll move on and whatever and it won't matter anymore. Wrong. Please do not think that way. Personality typing is actually a really great exercise to better understand yourself, match yourself to better opportunities, and improve your relationships. So please don't take it for granted and let yourself really reveal to yourself who you really are. So this is, to me, one of the best personality tests out there. And just to kind of prove to you that personality matters, grab a pencil and we'll do a little exercise. So if I were to say, okay, get a pencil because I want you to sign your name, chances are you would pick up your pencil in your dominant hand and you'd grab paper and you'd actually start writing your name down. So I'm right-handed and my pencil would go in my right hand. And then if I asked you to do the very same exercise, switch hands, sign your name with your other hand, some people would groan and go, really? You're making me do this? Now you don't really have to do this in a video, but again, for example's sake, let's look at the reactions you would have to something like that, right? So how did it feel when you used your preferred hand? Well, it was probably easy and natural, quick, effortless. But when you switched to your other hand, it was probably much more difficult. You had to go more slowly. It was awkward or hard, tiring, draining. It took longer, more concentration and focus. Now, when you think about this analogy with using a pencil in your dominant or less than dominant hand, chances are if you were required to, you could get better at using the other hand if you needed to, okay? But using your preferred hand is going to make you more efficient and successful, right? If you were forced to do your other hand, you could probably develop those abilities and you'd be okay. But you might not be as satisfied and you might not be as efficient or effective as a person. So that's kind of what we're getting into with personalities, is why don't we go with how you're hardwired, how you prefer things, how you see things, because it's going to make your work much more effortless and you'll be that much more successful in your performance. So that's kind of the analogy I want you to keep in your head. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize myself for the moment. And we're going to jump into personality types, or the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So you need a little bit of background to understand why we're using this and kind of where it came from and the science that is behind it. But just by way of preface, in career counseling, oftentimes they will focus on what we call the big three, which are your abilities, your interests, and your values. These are important, but they're really not enough to matching you to a solid career or graduate study or how to spend your life and your time. You really need to come at this with something much more personalized that goes into your preferences, the dimensions of you, how you see the world, and how you desire to interact with the world. These preferences that you have of how to operate and orient really reflect mental processes that are really basic to every human being out there, but clearly differ person to person. And so, trying to find the best job for you without taking these preferences into account is silly, right? It's like going on a vacation without a map, not knowing where you're going to go, with no itinerary. You might end up in the right place, but you might not. And unfortunately, many people have careers that are kind of accidental creations of happenstance rather than something strategic and directed and fulfilling. So let's be a little more proactive and do that. Okay, so jumping into the background of this test, this comes from psychology. And you might say, wait a second, I'm a sociology major or I'm a criminology major. Why are we going into psychology? We all know that psychology and sociology study human behavior, right? They just take different approaches. So we're going to backtrack for just a minute. The easiest way for me to explain the difference in approach between sociology and psychology is to do what I call going outside in and inside out. So if I were just to explain in very simple terms how psychologists look at the world, they go from the inside out. So they start with you and what makes you tick and how you drive your interaction and behavior toward the people that surround you, external to you. So they're internally focused on your external behavior, okay? Sociology also studies a lot of the same things, but they just take an opposite approach. So in sociology, you are outside in. They look at your environment, your context, and all that surrounds you and how that has an impact on how you create your identity, and make the choices of behavior. So again, they're both studying human behavior from some perspective or another, but sociology is going to look more at external factors and psychology will look more at internal ones. Both are correct. Both get after human behavior in really important ways. But we have to use both of them sometimes to get after what we're really trying to find out. So that's just kind of a quick background when we think about the psychology we're using in this module. So here's the history. Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, that's how you say that name. It's not Carl Jung, it's Carl Jung, and Sigmund Freud inspired two American women, Katharine Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers, who determined that behavior may be unpredictable unless ideas of personality, mental attitudes, and the attitudes people preferred were better identified and understood. So this was really a great development in the field of psychology at the time, where we were trying to really expand all the different ways that people preferred to interact with the world in different circumstances. So this is kind of how we got here. Now you're thinking, Katharine Briggs, Isabel Briggs Myers, they must be related, mother-daughter, okay? So they were actual kind of followers of Freud, and they were also following Jung's work, and were trying to develop personality beyond what those two psychologists had come up with. So in the 1940s, now remember Carl Jung was in the 1920s, but in the 1940s, Katharine Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers developed the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the MBTI for short, which provides 4 personality preference scales and 16 distinct personality types. So they took the work of their predecessors and really expanded upon it. So this is the exciting part where we get much more accuracy into further identifying who we are. So these are the 4 personality dimensions, and they go from kind of one part of the spectrum to another. So it's extroversion and introversion, sensing and intuition, thinking and feeling, judging and perceiving. These are really important to keep track of, so make sure you make a good note of these. Okay, so one thing I also want to mention is it's not kind of good or bad or better or best or one versus the other. It's more of, kind of what suits you, okay? I want to make sure we don't kind of pit one against another as being preferred or better. It's easy to fall into a trap like that, and we don't want to do this. We're really after achieving a great degree of self-awareness and have an experience finding ourselves before we make any decisions that have really long-lasting career consequences. So we don't need to get after good and better or strong or weak or anything like that. We're just trying to put a conscious effort into determining the real you, your own natural strengths and inclinations. And this is where type is so helpful, because you get a systematic, effective way to evaluate your strong points and some probable weaknesses or blind spots that you have, and maybe learn how to navigate those a little bit better. And once you have all these figured out, you'll know how to make sure you're always operating from a position of strength and being your most effective self, whether it's professionally or personally. So, when we get into personality typing, Each of the personality types is described by a 4-letter code, each indicating one of those personality dimensions. If you're not sure what these acronyms mean, don't worry about it for now. We'll look at this in more detail later. But personality type is very consistent over the life course. Despite changing their behaviors to adapt to different relationships or situations, given what functions people are trying to accomplish. Keep in mind we often change our behavior to maximize our interests, but we don't change our personalities. And unfortunately, some people are kind of forced by circumstances to act in a certain way until they literally don't feel themselves anymore. Or even maybe because they're coping with a crisis or trauma. So we get into what we call survival mode, right? But we all start out with a particular personality type that predisposes us to behave in certain ways throughout our lives. And we may have some areas of our personality that are more central to our survival that will arise and kind of take the leadership role in some circumstances versus others. So this is really important to keep track of so that we can make sure we maximize our own potential here. These are the acronyms we're talking about. So we kind of use little abbreviations for all of them. And then basically it's the first letter of the word with the exception of intuition, right? Because we already use I for introverted. So you're either extroverted or introverted, prefer sensing or tuition, thinking or feeling, and judging or perceiving. So because there are this many personality dimensions, we have up to 16 different combinations that we could get. So again, just keep in mind that the intuition is represented by an N. Okay? So by the end of this module, you will have identified yourself as one of these 16 different types. Again, with different combinations of these letters. And we'll get into that in a moment. So you could certainly go into the book and go into the descriptions of each of these dimensions and try to do it yourself. But to me, the easier thing to do is to go to Truity.com and take the Type Finder personality test. It's a web-based, kind of abbreviated version of the MBTI, and it's pretty straightforward. And I think it's a good place to start. So once you go to Truity.com, and by the way, Truity is just one of many websites that offer a version of the MBTI. There are certainly others, and you may find some that you like better. And you are welcome to use that. Again, as long as they reference the Myers-Briggs type indicator, then you're on the same test. Once you finish a test at Truity.com, you'll get a result that looks kind of like this. So it says, this is a very good match. This one could also be a very good match. Here's some others that are good matches, but you'll usually get 2 or 3 that are possibilities. And these, when you look at them, are kind of like, yeah, that seems to fit me. Well, that one seems to fit me too. So let me take a look at how maybe one could be more accurate over another. So these are my results. My results are ENFP, ENTP, or ENFJ. So those are all actually quite different. But for sure, I feel pretty solid on the fact that I'm extroverted. I use intuition over sensing a little bit more. But when it comes to feeling versus thinking or judging versus perception, that's when there is some variation for me. And you may find yourself in a similar situation. Okay, so in this situation, when you have a couple of possibilities and you're sorting through them all, use the Tiger et al. 2014 text to further determine your type. Okay, so there are charts and I have documents on our course website to help you get after more detail and really try to narrow down your type. I also have a few recommendations at this stage. So again, as you are honing in on which of the dimensions you are more accurately going to be represented by, there are a few tips and tricks I would like to offer. Essentially, you are estimating your type preference for each of the 4 dimensions, and you'll end up with your 4-letter code. Some of them you will be a little bit stuck with. Don't worry too much about the terms used to describe the dimensions. They might not mean exactly what you think they do. And in fact, they often mean something a little bit different. So don't get hung up on, thinking or feeling or sensing describing you as a certain kind of person. They're actually quite a bit more specific when it comes to personality testing versus maybe what common descriptions of these things might be. Essentially, everyone fits into one of the 16 categories, so we'll back up just a little bit. And again, you may find yourself really struggling between 2, 3, maybe 6 different types of personalities. So, when we get into actually boiling it down, if you're really struggling with, am I really on this side or this side? Some ways to kind of get after a hard and fast answer would be to ask yourself, if I had to be one way or the other for the rest of my life, which way would I choose? And sometimes it's hard to decide between the preferences because of the way we change with age. You may be more interested in one world versus another than you were previously, or maybe because of the demands made upon you by the roles you have in your life or your job. Maybe you learned how to function better in one way because your job requires that of you. So you have to kind of be honest, and some people say, maybe I need to ask someone that knows me well, that I trust, to maybe help me sort out and split hairs between these differences. I'll kind of coach you a little bit as we go, but again, only you can really accurately type yourself. So I don't want you to lose sleep over this, but there are things that can make the process easier. And again, it just goes down to, where do you find yourself most of the time? What is your default in most situations? That might be a way to think about it that would be useful to you. So I'm going to make a quick departure from this lecture and go over to a document that I've been working on for you in class. So essentially, this is a copy of the chart you'll find in the textbook, where you can really look carefully at one side or another of the spectrum. So if you're kind of choosing between extroverts or introverts, this will really help you do that. And this kind of gives away my personality type. I'm not as focused on details as I should be, so I misspelled extrovert versus introvert. So that means I am more of an intuitor than I am a sensor. Sensors often do better with details, and intuitors do better with big picture. So right there is the example of how that impacts my work. But that's not saying that is the ultimate explanation for people who misspell words. It's absolutely not. But it gives me some insight, maybe more than I had before. So this document is available on Canvas, where you can kind of have an electronic means of going through these choices of the dimensions and kind of putting a check mark next to the box or highlighting the side that you find yourself on. So if you want to do everything 100% electronic, you could just use a highlighter tool and highlight the side that matches you, and then kind of where more of your highlights are is where you would naturally be. So in this particular section, there are 9 areas. And so that way you kind of have a tiebreaker if you come out fairly even as you go from side to side. So this is one other method you can use to split hairs and really get after one side or another, because some people struggle with these dimensions. The one I probably struggled the most with was thinking and perceiving. I can kind of be pretty evenly balanced on those two. That one's a tough one. Sensing and intuition became a little more obvious as I went through this exercise. But yeah, thinking and perceiving was my toughest one. For others, your tough one might be extrovert, introvert. And so it doesn't matter which one maybe is the one that you struggle to identify, but the point is to get after it. So we'll go back to the lecture. Okay, so now that we're kind of jumping into the details, our next set of slides is we're going to go into more thorough analysis of extrovert or introvert, and we'll leave that for the next lecture. So I will see you then.